Let's start off with our first question. Judy asked, I'm behind, I'm stressed. What's the single most important next step I can do to gain momentum? So, Matthew, what's the secret here? How do we get that momentum when we're feeling behind and stuck?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the dissertation process is a momentum building process, right? Each step leads to the next, to the next, to the next. And so when you get kind of knocked off that track, getting back on and getting started again can understandably be a very difficult and challenging place to find yourself. So here's what I would suggest. We think about the dissertation. We always use this phrase, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time, right? And so we want to take a look at the bites that we've already taken. Give yourself some credit for that and try to figure out where really are we on this journey towards a complete dissertation. And then you have to just force yourself to take that next step, take that next bite on your journey. If you haven't already mapped your journey out, that can be a very effective way to build or rebuild momentum. Start from day one. Even if you're already like a year and a half into the process, start from day one, map that journey out. What are those benchmarks? What are those steps? When did you hit them? When do you anticipate hitting them? And that will give you a sense of accomplishment and help you kind of figure out, where do we go from here? How do I get back on the journey?
I think that's really great advice. Something else that's really beneficial is focus on identifying those wins, those success points. So break it into small tasks, get that task done, and then celebrate it. And the reason we want to celebrate those tasks is we want to be process oriented. So we want to build momentum by succeeding at processes. And yes, when you celebrate those wins, you're releasing dopamine, you're giving yourself the feel good hormone as well. And that's going to help you build that momentum as well. And then also set those timelines and deadlines, because that's going to be really helpful for getting you moving forward and making progress. So let's look at our next question. And this one's about maintaining progress when waiting for feedback. So Mohammed asked, what should I do while I'm waiting for my supervisor's feedback so I don't lose that momentum? So we've all had that where a supervisor is taking 2 to 8 weeks to get your feedback back. What can we work on at that time, Matthew?
Yeah. Oh boy, I had a great relationship with my supervisor, but man, he was slow. And so I definitely resonate with this question. And so, what can we do about that? Well, there's not much we can do once we've hit send, right? We've sent that draft off, we're waiting on that feedback. And so, how can we be productive with the 2, 3, 4, sometimes 8 weeks or longer that you might be waiting for that feedback to come in? So, a couple of thoughts here. First, I think it's okay to give yourself a break during that window. If you know that consistently your advisor is a 3-week turnaround, give yourself a breather for 3 weeks. You know that that's coming. You can see that on the horizon. And it can be hard for us sometimes to allow ourselves to rest during the dissertation process because we want to get it done. We're moving and we have this big, ambitious goal ahead of us. But you're not going to make it to the end if you don't rest. So that's a great time for that long weekend, for that family trip that you've been talking about, for a trip to the spa, get a massage, whatever it is that kind of boosts you back up. Use that window as an opportunity to give yourself permission to rest. Remember that rest is not about stopping. Rest is about fueling for the next phase. So if you have a good idea of how long that chunk is going to be, I think rest is really good. It can be difficult to rest if we don't know how long that chunk is going to be. So if we're anticipating turnaround in a week and it's actually 6 weeks, that can be really agonizing. So what can we do during that window? I think it's a great opportunity to start thinking about what comes next. So let's say that you have submitted your literature review and you anticipated a 1-week turnaround, but for whatever reason, we're 3 weeks in, we still don't have feedback. go ahead, start working on that chapter 3. Start pulling that draft together because you're going to have to do that eventually. We can always work ahead, and then we pivot and respond once we get that information back from our advisor. There are things that are going to have to be incorporated, right? So you can go ahead and start working on those pieces ahead of time. The key is we want to make sure that we carry advisor feedback forward. So in my example, if I'm working on chapter 2, that's been sent off. I start chapter 3 early. When I get my chapter 2 feedback, I want to make sure I carry that feedback forward into my chapter 3. So I pick that chapter 3 back up. I make the edits to try to align with that prior feedback before I submit. But I think those are really the two best strategies. We can either give ourselves permission to rest, which is really what I would advise you to do. But if you can't rest because the stress and anxiety and the looming is feeling too heavy, go ahead, start working ahead. Work on that second chunk, that next chapter, get ahead on that work.
I think that's really good advice, particularly the rest. I was working with a client back in 2022 and she was waiting for feedback. She was feeling like she had to move forward. She had to start working on the next section. So I told her, just take a weekend. If nothing else, take that weekend. And she grumbled a bit about it. And I said, no, you've got to do this for your own mental health so you don't burn out. And then she took that weekend off and she said she didn't do any work. She didn't think about her project. And she said when she came back after that weekend, she hadn't got the feedback yet from her supervisor, but in taking that break, her brain had been thinking about what to do next. And she came back and she's like, I've got this idea. I've got this plan. And we were then able to really make progress. So just to reiterate, rest is important. And then specifically, as Matthew said, start planning. Even if you're not writing the next chapter, start planning what information you need to get. Get those resources together. Just do the small steps that you can to make progress. And if you're further down in the line, if you're waiting for that final feedback, then start planning your defense, your Viva presentation. Those are things that you can practice, even if it's just talking about your research to your friends. So the next question, it's about the dreaded research topic. So Abdul Kadir asked, is there an easy way to identify a potential research topic? Now, this is a broad question, I know, but Matthew, are there any secret techniques we can give them, any ideas we can suggest on how to go about finding that research topic?
Yeah, this is a really common question that we hear a lot at Grad Coach because you've got to pick that right topic. It's going to carry you through your whole project. And so it feels like a pretty looming decision. So a couple of thoughts here. First, I want you to lower the pressure on your research topic. A lot of us enter into this dissertation process thinking that we're getting ready to do the most important work we will ever do in our entire lives. But really, it's the first big piece of research in your career, right? It's setting you up for that career of research and development and application. And so we can pull the scope down and take some of the pressure off. And I think that really helps us to get in a healthier mindset for choosing our topic. The next thing I want you to think about is what are you actually interested in? You're going to be reading about, talking about, thinking about, studying this topic for potentially 2, maybe 3 years of your life, maybe longer. It has to be a topic that you actually care about. So think about, what do you actually want to learn? What do you actually want to create and put out there and build upon in your career moving forward once you get those important credentials and letters behind your name? So what do you really care about? From there, the next step I would think through is, what does your advisor really care about? If you're still really struggling to find something that is going to motivate you, align your work to your advisor's work. Why do we do that? Well, they're going to be more interested in your project, which means they're going to be more communicative. They're going to talk to you. They're going to offer you more resources. They're going to help you. They've already got a research library that they've built about that topic if it's something that they care about and have published on. So if you're still not really sure from your own interests where to go, maybe align to your advisor's interest. And then the last thing I would say here is go back through your coursework. because throughout your coursework, you have written papers, you've done those, 30, 50, 100-page term papers throughout your program where you have examined different topics and different ideas. And in doing so, think about what interested you from that, or what gaps or questions did you have from those papers that you've written. And that can be really meaningful for finding your research process or finding your research topic, because it allows you to dig into work you've already done and kind of launches you forward when it's time to actually start writing that dissertation.
I think those are really good points, particularly aligning with your advisor and aligning with your interests. That's going to give you a good jump start. The other thing I can suggest is if you are really interested in a specific field or area of research, look for systematic reviews, narrative reviews, meta-analyses, papers that synthesize what's happening in the field. Make sure those are papers from the last year or two, so it's recent, and then look at what they are suggesting future research look into. And the other bit of advice I can say is take advantage of a context gap. If you see a really cool paper that's really interesting, that's been done in a different country, in a different region, in a different environment, think about how you might be able to apply that research in areas and regions that you have access to. And that's a great way to build up a potential topic without having to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So we're going to take a question that Bunmi submitted live. Can you please explain the concept of ontology and epistemology in layman's language and how to apply them to your field of research?
All right. Well, really bringing out the doozies here on this one. Yeah. So let's kind of break this down. So ontology and epistemology are philosophies. Okay. So if they feel a little ethereal, you're having a hard time getting your hands around them, that's why. They are by nature a little ethereal. They're sort of squishy concepts because they are philosophies. And a lot of us come into our doctoral work because we like the concrete. We're here, we're ready to experiment and do that randomized controlled trial and run that statistical analysis. So it can be hard to wrap our heads around these techniques, these terms. So I want to just start by saying that's okay if you're kind of struggling with that. I think a lot of us do. And even those of us who do this and talk about this all the time sometimes still have to sit back and go, wait a minute, which one is that? So let me see if I can break these down into layman terms. Ontology thinks about what is real, what is reality, okay? So it's thinking about what actually exists, what is a real phenomena versus maybe a perception or a idea, a community derived concept, right? What things make up the world? What is our reality? Okay. So David said this was a broad question. We don't get much more broad than what is reality. But that's what we think about with ontology. Epistemology is about knowledge. So what is knowledge? How do we know if something is true? How do we know what kinds of evidence is good evidence? How can we ever be certain about anything in the world? So ontology is sort of what is reality, epistemology, what is knowledge. Now, why do they matter for your dissertation? Because in your dissertation, you are essentially creating new knowledge. And so having that epistemological framework or understanding is really important up front, because if you are creating new knowledge, then you need to be able to talk about what knowledge is. So here's how I would approach this and advise you to sort of break this down. I'm assuming that you are asking this question because you have to write about this in some capacity, probably in your chapter 1. That's usually where I see these kinds of sections, maybe in your literature review. But we're often asked to think about an epistemological framework. So pull out your epistemology textbook. If you don't have one, I really like the Oxford Handbook on Epistemology. That's my go-to. It's back here on the shelf somewhere. Pull out your textbook and kind of remind yourself of the different kinds of knowledge that are encapsulated within the framework of epistemology. And then think about what really applies best to your question and what you're hoping to work with. So, for example, I do a lot of work in my research work with in vivo knowledge, which is knowledge that is created through doing the thing. I'm an educator by training. My research work is in K 12 education for the most part. And so I go in, I talk to educators, and I'm trying to pull their learned knowledge that they've gained through their experience, their practitioner knowledge. I pull that out, combine that with whatever else I'm doing, and that practitioner knowledge becomes my frame. So I would say go through one of those handbooks, identify which kind of epistemology, which sort of sub area makes the most sense to you, what jumps out to you. Is it pragmatism, where we're really thinking about application? Is it maybe practitioner knowledge? Is it something more theoretical? And use that as your launching off point.
Thanks, Matthew. Definitely not an easy one to work with. Epistemology, ontology, I will be the first one to say I always have to look it up every time I have to use it because I forget which one is which and how to apply them. I think you've provided a great overview of it. I think really importantly, if you are getting stuck on this, look for research that's been done in your field, particularly dissertations. If they've got an epistemology section or an ontology section, that can also help you get an idea of what might be appropriate in your field. But again, always go back to the textbooks. That's the safest place to start because they have put it out in sometimes layman's terms. I know Oxford is good. Some of them are not. So definitely work in that space. So our next question, it's about reading and how to do that effectively. So Denise asked, how do I use my research questions as filters when I'm looking for literature and reading? So I'm not reading everything. So Matthew, how do we let our research questions guide our engagement with the literature? And how do we let that help us in that scope to make things a little bit more accessible?
Yeah, this is a great one because, it can be really disheartening sometimes when you throw a keyword into a search engine and you get 5,000, 7,000, 20,000 articles back because you're not going to read that. Nobody ever is, right? That's totally unrealistic. So, how can we use our research questions to kind of guide that? So, first, I think we can use our research questions to guide our search strategy. So, you should never start your literature review search without first having built a search strategy that includes keywords and the databases that you're going to look at, as well as any filters you're going to apply. So, I always do this work in a spreadsheet because I like the neat little columns and cells. But go in there, take your question, and break it down into keywords. Think about both common keywords today, but also keywords from past or prior eras of research. So, a good example from my work, I do a lot of work around English language learners. Today, we might call those students English learners. We might call them multilingual learners, but in the past, they've been called English as a second language learner, right? And so we would want to use that prior term as a keyword in addition to more modern terms as we're doing our search. So break that down into several keywords, identify the databases, and then identify what filters you're going to use. Are you going to apply maybe just the past 5 years, just the past 10 years for your search? Also, think about other criteria that you're going to check for. So, when I am doing a literature review, I'm doing my search, I'm going through and I'm looking at titles and abstracts, and I'm pulling papers that I want to read. But I'm not reading as I go. I'm pulling papers, I'm making a little library for myself that I'm going to read later because it really gets confusing if you try to read as you pull because every time you hit refresh, the stuff moves around on the screen. So I'm reading abstracts, I'm reading titles, and I'm pulling stuff that further resonates with my question. So I'm going to ask myself, after I've read this abstract, does this resonate with my question? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Or are there other contexts? So maybe I only want to look at studies that have been done in the UK, that I'm going to filter those out as I do my abstracts. A lot of my clients right now, I'm telling to really focus on research post-pandemic because the post-pandemic world is very different than the pre-pandemic world. And so I might look to see, is the pandemic addressed in the title or the abstract? That could give me important context. So I think it's all about the strategy. How do we build a strategy based on our research questions and then use that research question and kind of ask ourselves, could this paper, based on the title and the abstract, could it help me answer my question? And if it can, it goes in a folder to read later. If it can't, scroll to the next one.
That's really good advice. Making sure that you're putting limitations and ring fencing what you want to cut. So you can't read all the papers. But if you say, I'm going to read all the papers published since the pandemic or in the last 5 years, that's going to immediately bring it down. The other thing you can also consider is maybe you look at the quality of the papers as well. Are they from reputable journals? Are they from common journals in the field? And then, as Matthew said, have a folder that is for papers that you're going to read. Have a folder for papers that you're unsure about. Because if you're unsure about it, if you've got time, maybe when you're waiting for supervisor feedback, then you can go and take a look at that paper. But if you don't have time, then it can just stay in that folder. And if it's not useful, don't read it. Just leave it out of your list. That's generally going to help you. And then, as Matthew said, it's really about your search strategy. So finding out what are the key ideas, what are key concepts that you want to convey, and using that to guide your approach. So our next question is also about the literature review, this time about structure. So Robert asked, what broad sections should be covered in my literature review? Obviously, we can't go into the specifics of Robert's case, but more broadly, Matthew, what are some key areas that we should be thinking about when we structure our literature review chapter?
Yeah, so a literature review for a dissertation is a little different than the literature review that you're going to find in a journal article. And so I think that's the first thing that we have to wrap our heads around is that we're modeling this work off of dissertations, not of journal articles. So, quick tip, if you haven't already, contact the research librarian at your university, find a dissertation or two that have been recently approved by your advisor that have been successfully defended, and read those so that you can get a feel for what the expectation is at your university. When it comes to actually writing your literature review, in a dissertation, we're going to start with a broad introduction that says, this is my literature review, here's what we're going to talk about, and here's the sections that are coming. We usually write that last because you can't talk about the sections that are coming until after you've written them, right? But you're going to start with the introduction. You're usually going to include a couple of paragraphs about your search strategy. So you're going to identify the keywords that you used. You're going to talk about the databases that you accessed. So a couple paragraphs around your search strategy. And then we're going to move into the actual content of the literature review, which can be organized in a couple of ways. You might organize it chronologically. So if you're looking at something that has developed over time or maybe through different eras, then you might organize your literature review that way. Talk about how this developed from antiquity into the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, the Romantic period, etc. Right? That could be one way to flow. You might organize it by theme. You might look at, for example, I used the example of English learners earlier. So you might look at the changing population and demographics of English learners. You might look, that might be a section. The next section might be the languages that they speak and language acquisition processes for those languages moving into English, learning English as a second language. You might talk about the cognitive development of language and how at the elementary school level, language development looks like this, but at the high school level or adult levels, it looks like this. And so you can kind of break it up into themes like that. Then I also think that there's a more project-oriented approach that you can take where you're taking sort of the pieces of your experiment and you're making sure that each piece of your experiment is thoroughly discussed. So let's say that you're doing an experiment related to burnout. So you might talk about burnout theory. Then you might talk about job demand resource models. And then you might talk about your particular intervention that you're deploying and what that particular intervention has looked like. So it's a little more chunked out. It's not as necessarily maybe as smooth as some of the other models that I've mentioned, but it's really carefully aligned and tailored to your methodology and what you're actually going to do. However you approach it, the key here is we want to make sure that we are giving our reader enough background information that they understand why you're doing what you're doing, why you chose the methods, why you chose the instrument that you chose, and why your research matters.
That was exactly what I was going to say as well. It's really about thinking about your topic and figuring out what information do I need to give my reader so that they can follow my thinking. And so if you're looking at relationships between different variables, you might have a section on each variable and then the interrelations between those variables. But think about what information is needed, both in terms of past and current information as well. You need to engage with those seminal authors, the people who sort of introduced the field, the theoretical framing of your study, but then also the current research as well. And the last bit of advice I can suggest is towards the end of each of your broad sections, and particularly towards the end of your literature review chapter, it's really important to synthesize and pull out the gaps as you see it in the literature. What are the problems, the limitations, the issues? And those should really point to your research. So think about a upside down pyramid. You're going to start broad and general, and you're going to work your way through the literature to get to the specific problem that you are planning to address with your research. The next question is on managing perfectionism. And now this is a really common question that we come across at Grad Coach when we're coaching students. And the question is from Soraya, and she said, how do I stop perfectionism from delaying my dissertation for months? So Matthew, what is perfectionism? Why do we struggle with it? And what can we do to avoid it?
Yeah, you are singing my song, Soraya. Really, that was something that I had to deal with as a student and something I still have to deal with as a researcher and a working professional today. So let's break it down a little bit. So, first, perfection is really an ingrained part of our personality, right? It's something that most of us who experience that have dealt with our whole lives in one capacity or another. And it isn't something that you necessarily notice until it becomes a problem and it starts to become a stumbling block. And the dissertation is a very common place for that to happen because we put so much pressure on ourselves to have a perfect dissertation. But as I said earlier, the first step to that is peeling away that pressure. Your dissertation is not going to be perfect. It is not your magnum opus. It is not the most important piece of work that you will ever do. It will not define you as a human being, as a professional, as an adult moving forward. It is, for most of us, the first big piece of research. And the first of anything is not always very good. So we have to accept that, right? It's like making pancakes. The first pancake, we throw it away. But the fifth or sixth pancake, the fifth or sixth research project you do, once you have those letters, is going to be much better. My dissertation is, I'm sure, on the web. I'm sure you could find it. Don't go find it. I don't want you to read that because it's just not as good as the other work that I have. Go to my website, read some of my published work. That's better. That's where I want you to be. So I want you to just sort of shake that part off first. Next, I want you to remember that that perfectionist voice often comes from a sense of insecurity, a sense of imposter syndrome. And someone told me many years ago that imposter syndrome is really a good thing, that when you feel imposter syndrome, you should embrace that because it is a sign that you are growing and it is a sign that you are in the spot you're supposed to be. If you feel totally comfortable with everything that's going on around you and you're the smartest person in the room and everything comes easy to you, that's not where you want to be. You're pursuing a doctorate. You are someone who cares about momentum and change and growth. And the only way we change and grow is by pushing ourselves out of that comfort zone. And inevitably, imposter syndrome is going to come into play. So I want you to reframe that, sit in that imposter syndrome, and know that it's actually a sign that you're where you should be, that you've pushed yourself into that next space. I'll say when I started my dissertation, a good friend of mine pulled me aside and she said, I just want you to know that the best dissertation is a finished dissertation. And she said, that is what your goal is. Finish the dissertation no matter what. And so, are there things in my dissertation I would do differently? Absolutely. Are there things that I wanted to do differently or redo at the time? But ultimately, it got finished. I got my letters and I've had a really cool career and I've been able to do really cool stuff since then. So, focus on the goal, which is a finished dissertation, not a perfect dissertation.
I really agree with the idea that feeling imposter syndrome is a good thing in academia. It doesn't feel like it. It's scary. It's uncomfortable, but it's a sign that you're getting to the point where you're realizing the limitations of your knowledge. And that's good because if we know what our limitations are, we can push and learn to expand those. The other thing that I can say from a really practical perspective for dealing with perfectionism is really think about the difference between drafting and finalizing. Leave your perfectionism for the finalizing stage. Focus on production, making momentum, getting progress done when you're in the draft stage. So don't look for perfection. If it's your first draft or your second draft, it's an iterative process. We're always working through improving our research. So that's what I did. I struggled with perfectionism as well. I wanted to give my soup the best quality draft that I could. And that led me to actually going over time on my dissertation journey. If I could go back, I would have sent her drafts earlier because there's times where I spent hours and hours working on a paragraph that inevitably didn't make it into my dissertation because it wasn't that relevant, but I wanted it to be perfect when I made that draft. We're coming up to the end of our time, so I want to ask one more question, and I'm just looking through our list here, and I think a good one that I would like to do, and we always seem to end with them, is an AI related one. So how do I use AI tools safely for literature searching without ending up with unusable or uncitable sources? Matthew, any insights you can give us to effectively use the tools that exist, but not fall into the plagiarism and the issues that are associated with that?
Yeah, this is a great question and super timely because we're all thinking about AI and talking about it all the time. So, a couple of thoughts on this. First, I want you to use AI as part of your process, not your product. I feel like, David, we should get grad coach t shirts that say AI process, not product, because I say that all the time. It's okay to use AI to help speed up your processes, but we should not be using AI to generate the text of your dissertation. So that's the line. As soon as you are copying and pasting from an AI tool into your Word document, that is where you have crossed the line. And so I want to start clearly there. I also want to say, before I get into some more practical tips, you want to make sure that you are in compliance with your university's AI protocols and regulations. So check your handbook, talk to your advisor if you're concerned about this, because there are some universities I'm starting to see with some of my clients that are prohibiting AI use completely. And then I've got other universities who are allowing it in certain circumstances to certain degrees. And I've got a lot of folks who are having to use AI checkers, which are not very accurate, and that's causing some troubles for folks. If you're using the M dash punctuation mark in your English written dissertation, stop using the M dash because that is triggering all of the AI trackers, which hurts my soul because I am a prolific M dash user. I'm sure there's lots of them in my dissertation, but stop doing that. So those are the first two pieces: process, not product, and then triple check your university's expectations. And they might have changed since last semester. So stay tuned to that. Okay, so there's my warning so nobody gets flunked out. Let's talk about how you can actually use this. So, what does it mean to use AI for your process? I think it's all about choosing the right tools. So, I would not recommend using, for example, broad generative AI tools like ChatGPT or Gemini to do your literature search. They are more likely to hallucinate, to go out into the web and pull irrelevant articles, to make stuff up and try to convince you that it's a real article. Because that's kind of what they do, right? They algorithmically pull this stuff together and create text. So we don't want to use those tools for literature search. Instead, we want to find AI tools that are designed specifically for literature search. And there's really two categories of these. The first category kind of reads the papers and filters out and pulls the best papers based on the question that you've asked. Two of those tools that I like, one is Consensus, and the other is called Elicit. So those are great tools that you can find online. They have free and paid versions, and you kind of chat with them still. You ask them questions, but they really read the papers and then give you the papers that are most closely aligned to your question. But now, they are not going to give you everything. There's going to be gaps in what they find and pull for you. So you still have to do the other steps. You still have to mine literature out of the references lists that they give you. You still have to go in the databases and do your own searching, but they're good tools to kind of get you up on your feet with your literature review if you're having a hard time getting started. The second batch of tools connects literature based on sort of citation maps. And so the best one for that, I think, is called Research Rabbit. You upload a paper or you could drop in a DOI link. And what it does is it says, here are all the other papers written by this author. And so you can kind of look at them that way. Or it'll say, here are all the papers that this author cited and all the papers that those authors cited. And it puts these really cool network graphs together. So you can go through and find the different articles. It can also go the other way. So this article is 10 years old. Here's all the people who cited this article. Here's all the people who cited that article. And so you can get really comprehensive scans really fast using tools like that. So I think that's the best way to think about this. Think about the right tool for the task in front of you. And we're never, ever, ever, ever using AI to generate text for our dissertation.
What I'll also add there is really, if you are using AI tools, make sure you are using your prompts effectively. Look up a YouTube video or engage with the literature out there on how to effectively prompt AI tools. Because if you give it a bad question, it's going to give you a bad answer, or it's not going to give you a complete answer. My favorite tool is to ask it, what other information do you need from me in order to do this task? Because then it's going to tell you what it thinks is necessary in order to address that problem. So think about your prompts. Make sure that you're using it for processes, not for a product. And then please keep on track with what your university's stance is on AI, because this changes quickly, it changes drastically, and it can have really intense outcomes if you're caught on the wrong side of that. But that's all the time we had for today. I just want to thank you so much, all of you, for joining us, and thank Matthew. And then just as a reminder, our next Q&A session is in 2 weeks' time, same place. So feel free to sign up for that, and please submit those questions beforehand as well. But thanks so much for your time, everyone.
Thanks for joining us today. I hope to see you again in a couple weeks.